We are in Mark chapter 6 this week, and as we think about where we were last week, we were in Mark chapter 4 talking about the parable of the sowers and the different kinds of hearers that Jesus is addressing. And what's interesting is that after Mark chapter 4, as Jesus has kind of made this transition to talking in parables, and he's kind of veiling a bit of his teaching, is that Jesus kind of goes on this amazing healing spree. And in chapter 5, we see some of the most famous healings that Jesus ever has. He heals the demon-possessed man, right? This guy that Jesus goes to the Gentile side of the Sea of Galilee, and then he sees this demon-possessed man, and literally this guy who's demon-possessed, the demons can identify Jesus accurately. And Jesus casts this demon out, or a legion of demons out of this man. And this guy who was considered crazy and a wild man now has become like whole. And he is so overwhelmed with the healing that he's experienced that he wants to tell everyone about Jesus and follow him. And Jesus is like, you go back to your town and you tell them what the Lord has done to you. And then as Jesus continues walking about in Galilee and teaching, he comes to a region where he finds the synagogue leader coming to him and saying, my daughter is sick unto death. And so Jesus is going to go help the leader of a synagogue's daughter. His name's Jairus. And on the way to this unbelievable miracle that he's about to do, he is encountered these throngs of people that are around in this village. And as they're coming after him, there's one woman who has essentially been hemorrhaging. That's essentially, imagine as a woman if you had a period endlessly for years and years and years. I think it takes 16 years. And she's looking for healing. And she believes in Jesus so much that if I just touch the hem of his clothing, that I could be healed. That's how much she believed in Jesus. So as Jesus is on his way to go help Jairus' daughter, this woman touches him and gets healed from her ailment that she's had for most of her life. It's incredible. And Jesus was like, hey, what happened? Like, as though he didn't know. And he's looking around and it's like, wow, what a great miracle to this woman who's been essentially unclean to her community for years and years and years. And then Jesus goes, and Jairus' daughter has passed away by the time he got there. And Jesus goes in and he sends everyone out except for Peter and John, and he raises her from the dead. Talitha arise is what he says, right? Talitha kumi. So little girl arise, and she rises from the dead. And at this point, you could imagine that Jesus' ministry is it's going well. It's going well. These are good things. A lot of wins to pile up here in the Jesus victorious campaign, right? As he's preaching the good news is being received, and people are believing on Jesus. Awesome. Awesome. But I think what's happening here, as Mark is putting this account of the ministry of Jesus together, he wants us to understand that this is to set up for us the increasing rejection of Jesus. And how could you go for so many wins to all of a sudden such dryness and such hardness? And that's exactly what Mark wants us to understand. And so what we're going to do in Mark chapter 6 is we're going to look at 3 passages where we see that Jesus is expecting rejection. Expecting rejection. And that's our big idea. Jesus expected his rejection as the cost of all of the grace that he was preaching. Jesus is preaching the good news. He's preaching about the forgiveness of sins. And yet, we can sit there and go, wow, well, how come he's getting rejected? And how come this could lead to such bad things in the life of Jesus? And it's because that's exactly the point of where the grace is going. It's about Jesus being rejected. And so what we're going to do is we're going to see that Jesus was rejected at home. We're going to see that Jesus was rejected on the road. as he sent out his disciples in mission. And we're also going to see that Jesus would be rejected or expected rejection down the road in his own life, with the preview in John the Baptist. So first what we're going to do is we're going to look at Jesus expecting his rejection at home. And this is a picture right here. This is an old Greek painting of Jesus in the synagogue at Nazareth, his home synagogue. Jesus comes home, and this is a picture of the scene. And if you would stand with me, and we're going to read the text of Scripture together. Sorry, Miranda. I know you don't like standing for these, but I'm already standing, so it's easy. So we're going to read, if we go back one passage there. Is there a passage? There we go. We're going to read these together. So Mark chapter 6, verse 1. He went away from there and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. And on the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get these things? What is the wisdom given to him? How are such mighty works done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James, and Joseph, and Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. And Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor, except in his hometown and among his relatives and his own household." And he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he marveled because of their unbelief, and he went about the villages teaching. You may be seated. Let me go back one slide. Here we go. And could you imagine, right? So Jesus grew up in a village in Galilee called Nazareth, right? So working class little village that probably had just a few hundred people. Maybe some estimates are maybe like 500 people. So could you imagine, like, is anybody from a small town, really small town? Anybody? Okay. Plastow, there's 7,600 people in Plastow, right? But how about smaller than that? Really small? A few hundred? Okay. Okay. Well, but it's pretty small, right? And it gets to a point where does everyone pretty much know each other in town, right? You know who the mechanic is, right? Stan Castine's a mechanic, so just in case you didn't know. L&D Auto folks over in Brentwood. Nice. But in a small town, right, you get to know each other. You get to know who is what. You know the restaurants, you know the people, you know, oh, okay, if I get my car fixed over here, okay, we're gonna go shopping over here for supplies, right? And everyone knows each other, and you know who the local carpenters are, right? So could you imagine what it would be like to grow up in the town where Jesus grew up? I mean, that's crazy, right? Jesus, he's just like he grows up just like anybody else, right? He's a human. He's got skin. He's got needs, bodily needs, right? He needs to eat. He needs to be clothed, right? He needs a house over his head. He needs people to talk to him just like anybody else, right? And could you imagine having the privilege of watching God incarnate grow up in your town? Unbelievable, right? Now, if that were the case, how would you feel anytime Jesus would come home? Go ahead. How would you feel? What would that make you feel like? Right? That'd be good, right? What'd you say, Joe?
Kind of like you knew him, like you have a familiarity.
Familiarity. Go ahead, yeah. How else would you feel? Go ahead, Nancy, yeah?
Well, I'm thinking if everybody knew him and is used to seeing him around, they're going to say, he's not the guy. Why would it be him?
Maybe,
You know what I'm
maybe. But I think what about you though? Me? Yeah, if you grew up in the town that Jesus grew up, wouldn't that be pretty amazing?
Oh yeah.
I would be stoked. I tell everyone, dude, Jesus grew up here, man. And anytime he comes back, Jesus, it's me, it's Dave. What's going on, right? I would be proud of that. I would be very stoked about that. And I think you would be too with your believing heart, right? There'd be a sense where there's excitement for this, especially with all he's doing, right? It's kind of like, imagine if like Whitney Smith became a big, huge star someday. And we knew her. Wouldn't that be awesome? Like, and she goes around, imagine she was on American Idol one day, or The Voice. And then all of a sudden, and you know what? And then Matt behind her got real jealous. And he's like, how is she so famous? This is great. Right? But there's a sense when we see these people, right? Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Somebody from our town is that huge. Now, it's one thing to be famous. It's another thing to be Jesus. Okay? Jesus is another level here. We're talking miracle worker, right? We're talking somebody who's doing things. He's raising people from the dead, folks, right? This is not normal. This isn't just somebody on The Voice. You know what I mean? Your local hometown. Or there's some, Tom Bergeron is from Haverhill. Did you guys know that? Tom Bergeron, right? He's the host of Dancing with the Stars. Saw the guy at Skips one time. You know what I mean? But he just looked like some ordinary dude. Like, he didn't look famous. But that's Tom Bergeron. Okay, whatever, local celebrity. Jesus. Enter Jesus of worldwide fame, right? And he's from this town. And they have the most amazing privilege of knowing Jesus and knowing his family. And yet, they can't connect the dots on his true identity. That's incredible. That's incredible. And we would think that the people of Nazareth would be thrilled about him coming home. But in fact, their expectations were very low for Jesus. And a lot of it is because their expectations for their area were very, very low. And this can tend to happen, right, with the people that we know. Especially we know well, we know they're, a lot of times there's this sense where we're just like, not that special. They're not that special. And you've got stories, right? It's always the local person that's got stories about the famous person, right? But here it is that they, instead of looking at Jesus and embracing him with open arms, they're confused. They're confused by Jesus. Because they're hearing him teach in the synagogue, right? In the synagogue, what would happen? They would read from the Torah, and then somebody would be invited to come and teach on that, or maybe even they would read it and then teach. And in Luke chapter 4, we get to understand that this is actually Isaiah 61. And Jesus is reading Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Lord has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor and to bring liberty to the captives, right? And then Jesus sits down and says, this is fulfilled in your hearing. And they're going, whoa, where is this coming from, right? And so their first thought is, Jesus couldn't be like this. This had to come from somewhere. He doesn't have this innately. Where is this coming from? And their whole thought is, well, we know who he is. He's a carpenter. That's what he does. So how could a carpenter, and it's not like they're a derogatory thing. It's like they just know this is what he does. Oh, he's a carpenter, right? And not only that, he's the son of Mary, brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon. And just a footnote there for some of our Catholic friends that may not believe that Mary had other children. Here it is. It's right in Mark's Gospel. Right? Jesus' mother, Mary, had other children after him. Jesus is the oldest, and he's got a bunch of half-siblings. And you see even James, who would go on at one point to be the pastor in Jerusalem, the elder at Jerusalem, right? And not only that, get, have a whole ministry unto himself. And Judas is there, right? It's a different Judas, right? Not Judas Iscariot. But they're looking at this guy going, no, this doesn't connect. And Dan Castine, what's your favorite statement about familiarity?
Breeds contempt.
Familiarity breeds contempt. We hear that all the time, right? And what happens, there's this dynamic that happens where we can, I don't know, maybe in some instances be jealous. Jealous that somebody's kind of risen above and kind of made it and we haven't. Maybe that's it, how they're jealous of him. That could be part of it. And I think also there's a sense where we have a hard time being amazed at what's common to us. If something comes easy to you or natural to you or is common to you, you're less and less blown away by it, right? So for instance, your mother could make the best tiramisu in the world, the best. But the thing is, if you have it every single week, it becomes less impressive to you, right? So there's a sense where something common to us can lose its shininess. And that may be at work here with Jesus even. But Jesus is not shocked by their response. In fact, he anticipated it. And how did he anticipate it? He said, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown, among his relatives and his own household. Now, if Jesus knows anything, he knows the scriptures. And he knows the prophets were rejected by most of the people that they prophesied to. Moses was rejected, right? Jesus would even say in other places that Abel, right, from Cain and Abel, right, remember those two? That Abel was a sense a prophet or the righteous who was persecuted by his brother, right? Elijah he preached to the northern Israel that have gone into idolatry, and he was rejected by Ahab and Jezebel, right? And Jeremiah famously was sawn in two by Israel. Yikes, right? So a prophet's not without honor except in his hometown and even in his family. Jesus knows this. And the sad truth is that the people closest to grace can have the hardest time seeing it. The people closest to grace can have the hardest time seeing it. And I've seen this in family dynamics all over the place. You would think that, in families where you have a pastor as a father, right, and a believing wife, that their children would somehow come to faith in Jesus. And often they don't. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And I myself, I'm in a family where there's only a couple of us who are believers. My sisters have not come to follow Jesus. Even though I've seen the work of grace in our lives and how God could take my mother and my father after they're divorced and have them to come to Jesus and be brothers and sisters in Christ. They can see that miracle and still be unconvinced. That happens to us a lot. And it should go to help us understand, right, that it's very difficult when you're so close to grace to be affected by it. Why? Because maybe it's common to you? I don't know. But what's also interesting is that Jesus' family thought Jesus was mental. They thought he was crazy, right? In Mark 3, it says that when he went home and a crowd gathered again so that they could not even eat. And when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, and they were saying he is out of his mind. And even later in the chapter, after he's called by the Sadducees, the son of Beelzebul, or the scribes called the son of Beelzebul, like, you're the devil, dude. His family was coming to him and being like, hey, Jesus, just come home, right? And here's Jesus' response to that. His mother and his brothers came standing outside, they said to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they said, your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you. And he answered them, who are my mother and my brothers? And looking about those who sat around him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother. And weren't we just experiencing that when we were praying not too long ago? Is people saying, I'm closer to people here than in my own family. That's what grace does to us. It's incredible. And there's a sense where we can actually understand that the people closest to grace don't get it. And doesn't this underscore, I think, and we need to appreciate, how rare and how much of a miracle it is to have faith in Jesus? It's a miracle. It really is a miracle. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 2, he says, now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God. And we might understand the things freely given, that we might understand the things freely given to us by God. And we impart this in words not taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit, interpreting spiritual truths to those who are spiritual. The natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him, and he is not able to understand them because they are spiritually discerned. It takes the Spirit of God acting in your life in a special way for you to see and embrace Jesus. And we can't expect that to be a commonplace thing. Miracles are not everywhere. It's why they're called miracles. And really, we have the gift of faith that's been given to us. We need to appreciate that, especially as we consider Jesus at home, him expecting himself to be rejected there. And though Jesus was still gracious enough to lay hands on some and heal some who were in Nazareth, he marveled at their unbelief, and he moved on. He moved on to other towns and other areas. So he was rejected at home. He expected that. And he also expected to be rejected on the road. And so this is the account right here. There's a painting of Jesus commissioning his 12 to go 2 by 2 and go preach the gospel throughout the region. And we read about this in Mark chapter 6, verses 7 through 13. And would you stand with me and we'll read together these passages. We're just going to skip a couple passages here, but let's read together. And he called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. He charged them to take nothing for their journey except the staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and to not put on 2 tunics. So they went out and proclaimed that people should repent, and they cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and healed them. You may be seated. Including you, Whitney. You may be seated. Now, I love observing the leadership of Jesus amongst his disciples. It's awesome. And Jesus, and not obviously he's in Nazareth, not seeing faith. In his disciples, he does see faith. He does see their embracing of him. And I love how Jesus empowered them and called them into mission. Now, in contrast to the unbelief at Nazareth, Jesus empowered his believing disciples to preach the gospel in pairs throughout the region with authority over demonic spirits. Woo. Woo. Now, how would you feel if Jesus did this to you? If you got this call, how would you feel? Go ahead. What's your response? Ghostbusters is what? That's interesting. Okay, demon busters. Okay, in a certain sense. But what would you be excited about this?
I'd be afraid.
You'd be terrified.
Yeah.
Would anybody else be just like what? Yeah, Rob.
I wouldn't like the whole, don't bring anything except like a shirt and a staff.
Yeah.
No money, no food, especially the no food part.
And anybody a survivalist out there, right? Living on the charity of others? Anybody for that? This is terrifying, right? This is not something that we would choose, right? But think about this. What's he actually asking them to do?
Trust him.
This is huge, right? He sees faith in them, and what's he doing? He's saying, there's going to be more. He's going to grow them through this process. Now, how can Jesus empower them to do this? And what's he asking them to do besides trust him? What's really behind that? Well, what do good leaders do? Before they ever ask people to do things, what do? They do it themselves. They model it, right? Think about that. Jesus is asking them to do what he does. This is Jesus style. Hey, Jesus has no place to lay his head. Jesus doesn't have a backpack with supplies. Jesus is 100% reliant on God to provide for him through mainly the generosity of others. Right? Jesus said he has no place to lay his head. Jesus Just a newsflash, in case you didn't know this, Jesus was homeless. Right? He was homeless, and most of the time he's tenting it out with his disciples, or he's staying at the homes of others who were generous to him. Not that he's always asking, but people offer, right? So Jesus is at the mercy of others in a certain sense. And so what is he? Yeah, he's exactly right. You guys are exactly right. He's calling his disciples to imitate him, right? And so if you think about this, Jesus was preaching and casting out demons, and they did the same. He went without, extra preparations and extra clothes and food and anything like that, and that's exactly what he's calling them to do. So now, what they didn't yet grasp was why he wants them to do this. Why call the disciples to do this? Anybody have a clue? Why is he having them do this?
Vision of things to come.
Exactly right, Dan. This is about things to come. What they don't realize is that they're going to be without Jesus for most of the rest of their lives. He's preparing them for his own rejection. And along the way, he even actually instructs them on what to do depending upon people's response to you. And if we look at verse 10, right? He said to them, whenever you enter a house, stay there until you depart from there. And if any place will not receive you, they will not listen to you. When you leave, shake off the dust that is on your feet as a testimony against them. Jesus is expecting that his disciples will be rejected just like him. Jesus is calling us to imitate him in more than just one way. And when we are like Jesus, we are going to experience the responses that Jesus gets, right? If Jesus was rejected, then his followers will be rejected. It's tough, isn't it? It's tough to swallow because we want a life of ease. We want Mark chapter 5, not Mark chapter 6, right? We want the miracles, or we want what we just read about. Look at all the miracles they're doing. That's awesome, casting out demons. Oh, by the way, they're preaching and calling people to repentance. And they're talking about the healing that Jesus is to give us through his own death and resurrection. And so they're there living on God. And Jesus would even tell them, he would tell them in Mark 8, he says, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life would lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. So this notion is reiterated over and over and over again in Jesus, obviously in his ministry and his teaching, but also in the New Testament. And remember a couple years ago when we were in 1 Peter, didn't Peter remind us of this in 1 Peter chapter 4? Didn't he say, beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit and the glory of God rests upon you. Let none of you suffer as a murderer, or as a thief, or as an evildoer, as a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. So, because Jesus expects that he will be rejected, he's telling us we should expect that we will be rejected. And as Americans in the 21st century, it's very difficult to hear this. It's difficult because Christianity in America has enjoyed so much success in its history. Unless you think, Christianity is faltering. Oh, sure it is. But it's still the majority faith in America. And we have had the experience and the privilege of being the majority faith in America since its inception. You realize that, right? Do you even know what it's like to be in a culture where as a Christian you're in the minority? Do you even know what that's like? You don't, unless you've lived in some other place, right? I'm sure even Nelson and Eunice in Ghana, it's mostly Christian, right? So it's there's persecution in places just like there is here, but we don't experience that as much. We've never been the minority as a faith. But yet, Jesus was singular, not just a minority, singular, right? And Christians and early Christians would be the minority, the illegal minority. So that's the way we were hatched. And we get shocked when we even get any resistance. We're, oh my gosh, the bias against Christians. Oh, it's like, really? Really? Why are we surprised by that? I don't understand. Like, if we read our Bibles, we should actually be going, how come things aren't worse for us right now? Like, it's almost kind of frightening that things are too good. Because guess what? The rug will be pulled out from underneath us at some point. And the Lord is preparing us so that we not only expect rejection for Christ, but how about this? But that we rejoice in sharing the sufferings of God as a grace. Whew. That's a whole nother world from what we're used to. And this is exactly what Jesus expected. He's trying to prepare us for. So not only is he expecting rejection at home or on the road, but Jesus is also expecting rejection down the road. Down the road. And what this is a depiction here of the beheading of John the Baptist. And there's other portraits out there with John's head on a platter. I didn't want to show you that. Let's just anticipate what we're about to read right here in Mark chapter 6. So would you guys stand with me? We're going to read Mark 6, 14 to 16. You guys ready? King Herod heard of him, for Jesus' name had become known. Some said, John the Baptist has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. But others said, he is Elijah. And others said, he is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. You may be seated. Thank you. And as you can imagine, as a result of Mark chapter 5 and all the different things that Jesus had been doing up to that point and beyond, that his reputation was growing and growing and growing. His fame was growing. And particularly, Mark wants us to see there's a connection between Jesus' sending of his apostles or his disciples, they'd later become the apostles, but then the connection of the fame that Jesus gets as a result of their mission, the success of their mission. So what does mission success look like? It gets on the radar of the most powerful people on the planet, right? And particularly the most powerful people that are in their region. So Mark wants us to see that Jesus got the attention of Herod Antipas. And Herod Antipas was the ruler of Galilee. This is a bust of him. He was essentially what they call a tetrarch. He was a ruler over the region of Palestine, and his father was Herod the Great. So his father was the one, when Jesus was born, who wanted Jesus dead, right? Which is why Jesus fled to Egypt, right? And so Herod Antipas, he heard about what was happening, and he's like, oh my goodness, this is just like John the Baptist rising from the dead. And here's the thing, is that in Mark's gospel, we haven't even come across Mark's death yet. So what does Mark have to, or I'm sorry, John's death yet. So what does Mark have to do? He has to explain what happened to John. All we heard about is in chapter 1, he got arrested. And why did he get arrested? He got arrested because Herod Antipas divorced his wife because he was having an affair with his brother's wife. And so his brother Philip was married to Herodias. And so Herod Antipas was having an affair with Herodias. So what happened? He divorced his wife, Herod Antipas divorced his wife, and then Philip divorced Herodias. And then guess what? Antipas married Herodias. And John was like, you shouldn't be doing that, man. You're sitting here cheating on your own wife with your brother's wife, and now you're going to get married? Like, what is this? So Herodias hated John so much that she wanted John dead. Why? Because John is very famous, and he's publicly calling out the ruler of Galilee and his wife. So she wanted him dead. So this is why John ends up behind bars. Why? He's a righteous man, calling them out for their sin. And so now Mark has to give us the story, the backstory, what happened. It's a flashback now to how John got beheaded. And essentially on Herod Antipas's birthday, he had a big celebration. He had a big, huge festival. It was a pretty, their standard thing for the birthday of some, ruler like this. And he got kind of drunk, kind of what rulers do on their birthday at parties. And weirdly enough, his niece, Herodias' daughter, right? So the daughter that she had with his brother Philip was dancing for him and his friends. And it was probably something very sensual, right? And he, as it says, pleased her so much by her dancing. And who knows, this kind of harkens back to Esther a bit here. If you think about the book of Esther and as she's queen, became Queen Vashti, as she's dancing before the king. And pleased him so much that he said, I'll give you anything you want up to half the kingdom, which is a funny thing because he didn't have the authority to give away anything in his kingdom because it was a given kingdom. But anyhow, that's besides the point. The gesture is, I'm going to give you anything, just ask me for anything. And so in Herodias' daughter, she's probably maybe between the ages of 12 to 14, some estimates say, right? She's a young girl. She obviously she's young, she doesn't know what's going on. So she goes to her mom and says, Mom, what should I ask for? And so what does Herodias say? John the Baptist's head on a platter, right? And so guess what? Herod Antipas doesn't want to embarrass himself or embarrass, the court in front of his friends. And so he wants to save face. So even though he doesn't want to do this because he fears the people love John so much and he knows that John's a righteous guy, but he does it anyway. And he gets the executioner, boof, off with his head, and all of a sudden his head is served on a platter. So now Mark has the longest account of the death of John, more so than any other gospel writer. That's notable. Why is that notable? Because Mark is the shortest of gospels. And Mark doesn't have a whole lot of details on a lot of the words of Jesus like the other gospels do. So he takes time. He wants his readers to understand what happened. And why would that be? Who can think of why he would want us to know this so well and in detail?
Prepare people.
Rob, great answer. To prepare people. For what, Rob?
Like the persecution that's coming.
The persecution that's coming? Okay. How about one?
Death of an innocent.
How about, wow, right. Yeah, death of an innocent. And how about one innocent in particular? Lee, yeah?
John's role was to prepare the way of the Lord.
Excellent.
And so Mark starts his gospel with John.
Mm-hmm.
John dies almost halfway through.
Yes.
And so John's going to die, and he's preparing the way, and he's going the direction of Jesus. Then Jesus is going to die.
This is to prepare us for the death of Jesus. That's where this gospel's going, in case you didn't know. And so there it is. There it is. And this is a foreshadowing of the death of Jesus and the rejection of Jesus. And so Mark wants us to see that this is all part of the cards. This is all part of the plan. And it seems bizarre. How could such like a corrupt and weird encounter happen? So that somebody who's righteous and godly and believing and embracing Jesus would suffer? Well, what is Jesus? He's already been expecting this. A prophet is not accepted in his own town, is he? Neither is John, right? And this is all because this is all pointing us to what's going to happen with Jesus. And if we thought it was complex and corrupt with John, it's way worse with Jesus. It's way worse with Jesus. Because what's happening here is what, in Herod's thought, Jesus just symbolizes the skeletons in his own closet. He feels guilty. Oh no, is this John the Baptist? So he's kind of like scared. Like, what's this gonna mean? Right? So does that mean that like all of a sudden like he's gonna come back? It's almost like this Hamlet thing. The ghost is gonna come back and like, what's he gonna do to me? But what's curious too is he's talking about resurrection. Isn't that interesting? It's on the words, it's on the lips of Herod Antipas. He's talking about resurrection, a death and a resurrection, right? But what's going to happen to Jesus is a far worse situation. Jesus would be betrayed by Judas, his own disciple. And he would be given up to the chief priests. And he would be brought up on fabricated charges of blasphemy in the Jewish law and insurrection in the Roman law. And he would stand trial 6 times before the Sanhedrin, before the high priest, before Pontius Pilate, who is called the procurator of that area, and even before Herod Antipas. Because guess what? Even though Herod was from Galilee up in the north, he was visiting Jerusalem around the Passover. And he even had a trial before Jesus. And then finally Pontius Pilate, he gave in and he caved to the pressure of the crowds. We read about this in Mark 15, right? And as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, and they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." And the chief priests accused him of many things. And Pilate again asked, "Have you no answer to make? How many charges they bring against you?" But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. And then a little later, Pilate had offered, as it was their tradition around the Passover, to let a prisoner go. We'll let a prisoner go. Who do you want it to be? And he's hoping it's Jesus so that he doesn't have Jesus' blood on his hands. But guess what? That's not what happened. In Mark chapter 15, verse 12. And Pilate again said to them, "Then what shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews?" And they cried out again, "Crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowds, released for them Barabbas. And having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. This is incredible. This is a preview of the rejection of Jesus. Because this is exactly what Jesus knew would be the cost of grace. And if you think about it, this is the very fulfillment of the good news. So what's happening is actually the good news is being performed through the rejection of Jesus. Because what's going to happen is that the forgiveness of sins can only come through the substitutionary death of the Messiah. That's what the good news is. The good news is that you get forgiven. The good news is that you get blessed. But it's not for free. It's got to cost somebody because we all deserve judgment. We all deserve wrath for our rebellion and sin against God. And what's happened? That's falling on Jesus, the innocent. So what? So he can give you all the promises and the blessings and say, you're my child. You're my family, he says. How does he accomplish that? How does he purchase that? It's through the greatest of costs. And I don't think there can be a greater evil than the killing of the Son of God. I don't think there can be anything more vile than God himself being killed. It's the greatest. It's the highest of sins. It's the greatest of evils. And the greatest evil, the murder of the innocent and righteous God, was going to be used for the greatest of graces, to justify you, to justify us. And think about this. Think about this. God takes the greatest evil and uses it for your good. And I bet you right now we could just stop and can recount all of the evils that are happening to us. And not only that, all the evils that we have done. And we can't even possibly imagine that these things could be good for us somehow or work out for good somehow. But here's gospel logic. Here's the way the gospel works. If God can take the greatest evil and use it for your good, then he can take all lesser evils and use them for your good. This is crazy. This is gospel thinking. This is not natural thinking. It takes the Spirit of God to embrace this, doesn't it? Right? And we need to hear this, right? Why? Because there's so many experiences that we have of injustice, of evil, of pain, of sorrow, of rejection ourselves, right? The painful thing that we've been rejected by people, whether for the name of Jesus or for some other thing, right? And if our expectations are not aligned with the gospel, we're going to be very, very angry, or very, very hurt, or very, very depressed. But when we expect what is actually promised to us, we can actually go, oh my gosh, that's it? Just a little bit? It's not eternal. It's temporary. It's just a little bit. And it's not what happened to Jesus. He died so I didn't have to. He was judged so I wasn't have to. And anything here is temporary. And this is the way that the gospel comes to us, right? And remember Romans 8, right? This is Paul's logic for us here. And you can stay seated, but let's read this together. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? Friends, Jesus came expecting rejection. But he expected his rejection as the cost of grace for us. And I'm telling you, if that doesn't get you excited and get you hopeful about the future, I don't know if anything can. He takes all of this and says, for you, for you, for you. So let's pray and ask for the Lord's help.